So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. And so what I'm going to present is very preliminary. It's mostly descriptive, but I hope I can get some comments from you. So as we've seen already this morning, and don't have to explain it to this group, that there's been really a lot of research looking at the lasting impact of various cultural traits, both on institutions and economic performance. And so what I've been doing probably the last 7-8 years something is looking at a particular distinction between cultural families that's between individualism and collectivism. Here, there's nothing really new. This is actually what cross-cultural psychologists do. This is the main divide they look at, and so they've done many experiments across country on these things. So very quickly, individualist culture places the individual at the center, values individual rights and freedom, opportunity, individual success. It's based on a view of the world where the individual is not malleable, has particular fixed character traits. It goes back in a way to Plato. People have innate traits. The collectivist culture, on the other hand, sees individuals as embedded in a community, be it a tribe or a clan, and emphasizes more conformity, adaptation, harmony. It's based on a worldview where the individual is seen as completely malleable and can be made to adjust with enough effort. So there's a lot of literature on this, but this very briefly so that you have an idea of what definitions are being used. So empirically, when people look at this, they have been using mostly the measure of individualism versus collectivism that was developed by a Dutch sociologist Hofstede. So initially, this was based on surveys among IBM employees in the 70s, at a time when IBM was still the major global corporation. It was generalized to 76 countries. Now there are about 90, 92, 93 countries. And so it's based on factor analysis of survey questions. It's an indicator that loads positively on valuing individual freedom, opportunity, achievement, advancement, recognition, and loads negatively on valuing harmony, cooperation, good relations with superiors. So there's the measurements and the definitions are really pretty close. So that's one reason why it's quite popular. The main reason why this measure is very popular is that it's been validated by many other studies on smaller samples. So what really matters when you look at an indicator like this is really the ranking of countries, how countries compare to each other. A particular score doesn't mean much. It's really the ranking, and many studies have found very similar ranking. So just to have an idea, this would be a world map of individualism. So a larger score means you have a more individualistic culture. A smaller score means it's more collectivist. And so you see the map of the world. Not surprisingly, the most individualistic countries are Western countries, Anglo-Saxon countries, West European, Scandinavian, etc. And then the more collectivist cultures can be found, in different parts of the world, but many of them in Asia. So when you look at this, there are really several things that stand out. One is that there is a lot of variation, and it's a bit west-east, if you want to. So I don't want to, caricature. The other thing is that there's a lot of variation within each continent. So, for example, you can take India. India has a sort of more or less score in the middle, but is a rather individualistic compared to other Asian countries. India is the most individualistic countries of all developing countries. Whereas, China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia are more collectivist. But you also have variation in, for example, in Latin America If you look at the Andes region, so you see it's pretty green, so they have a low individualism score, so that's really the Andes region that covers part of Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, etc. In Africa, there's also variation, so Morocco is much more individualistic than, let's say, Ghana. And anyway, so this is a map of the data that people have been working. Of course, I've put it in bins, but what matters really is the ranking. So now these cultural differences between these two big cultural families certainly have important effects in today's world. Actually, in a paper with my colleague Gornichenko, we looked at the effect on innovation and long-run growth, putting actually culture in an endogenous growth model, and then looking at it from a cross-country point of view. We also found that these cultural differences matter in terms of, for example, the timing of democratization or the likelihood of having particular political institutions. And another paper with two colleagues, we've been looking a little bit at trade, where we find that the degree of vertical integration in multinational companies does vary according to the cultural framework. And then, one can think of many other areas where it actually matters, talking about what Bill was saying this morning. So, for example, openness to migration is actually quite linked to cultural values, though there are cycles on these things. But if you look in the long run, you do see important differences. So one question people have been asking, which is essentially what this talk is going to be about, is where do these cultural differences come from? And then many partial answers have been provided. So let me just give a list here without going into detail. Differences in historical pathogen prevalence, affecting how cultural values evolve. Even the frequency of particular gene variants affecting the intensity of pain from social exclusion, or the propensity to depression when faced with stressful events. Whether you were growing rice versus wheat, the past use of irrigation, etc. So there's a whole number of partial answers trying to explain this, but obviously they're very partial. So what I would like to do is to propose to come up with a more comprehensive answer and based on the institutions in the ancient past. And so why do I think this might be useful? Because if we go back in history, there is what Karl Jaspers has called the axial age, which was roughly the time between the 8th to the 3rd century BC. We find that that's roughly the time when the most important religions, philosophies of the current world actually emerged. And arguably, you can say that these philosophies and religion from the ancient past reflected, to a certain extent, those institutions. And we know that they do play an important role in modern culture, maybe more than we think. And so what I'm going to present you is very much in line with the argument presented by Alberto that he didn't have full time to develop. It's really about the coevolution of institutions and culture. And so I'm not going to try to come up with that difference. I'm just going to say that particular early institutions may have affected particular values and beliefs that helped consolidate both these institutions and the underlying culture. And given the inertia of culture, early institutions may have affected cultural values that are still relevant today. So let me go right in. And so what I'm going to propose is very much a comparative perspective. So some institutional systems in the past, take ancient Egypt, China, or Peru under the Inca, function more like centrally planned economies. They were economies where there was production, but production was organized by the state. The archaeologists or the anthropologists call that systems of distribution. For lack of a better word, I will call them statist systems. Other systems like Mesopotamia, Athens, the Aztecs, the Champa in South Vietnam were more like market economies. I will call them market systems. And then there were lots of systems that were really in between. So let me just start with the narrative, then I'll talk a little bit about the data. So if we compare Egypt, ancient Egypt versus Mesopotamia. Ancient Egypt, as we know, was a territorial state. This is actually an important distinction if we want to look at that. It was very, very fertile. And the particular conditions of these floods around the Nile were very important to create the fertility, and the conditions of productions around the Nile were pretty homogeneous. Essentially, you could grow cereals, based on the nutrients of the Nile, etc. Resources were allocated by the government. Internal markets were very limited, and foreign trade was essentially carried out by the government. Peasants who were working the land did not have private property over land. Households were not allowed to own private slaves. There was only public slaves. So we know the pyramids were built with slaves. So obviously there were a lot of slaves in ancient Egypt, but they were working for the government. They were public slaves. People were not allowed to have private slaves. Also, the laws in Egypt were not so much about relations between citizens, what you could call horizontal relations, but were about relations between the state and then the Egyptians. So essentially, what kind of punishment would there be for a violation of orders or commands from the pharaoh, etc. There was also very low stratification in society, and most people were unfree. There were elements of meritocratic government, and so from what we know from archaeologists, a big aspiration was to become a high-level official. By the way, it's still like that in China today. If you ask, the smartest people, what do you want to become, you would have very similar answer. Mesopotamia was very different. For a large part of its history, it was composed of city-states, starting from the Sumerian city-states. There was strong heterogeneity of conditions of production between the north and the south. So agricultural goods mostly in the south versus luxury goods, bronze, stone, and timber in the north. And so this heterogeneity was kind of propitious for trade. And so the potential from trade was quite high. There was a large role for private merchants. There were a lot of private craftsmen. There were markets for land, markets for slaves. Law was codifying relationships between citizens, in particular over private property, which is a big difference with Egypt. And aspirations, again, what we know is to become a big landlord. That's what people want to become big landlord. So if we take this division, you look at ancient China, as early as the Shang and the Zhou dynasties. We don't know that much about the Shang, but I had a colleague at Berkeley who died recently, who was one of the big world experts on the Shang dynasty. It's very much like Egypt. You had homogeneous conditions of production around the Yellow River. The law was very much top-down. It was not about rights of people. It was about using the law as an instrument of oppression. But there was a large role for clans, which, for example, is not at all the case in Egypt. And the emperor managed relations with clans grouped in cities. So there was a very strong division of labor and task specialization in early production. So this we know, for example, the way pottery, the way bronze was worked, that there was much more task specialization than in other countries. Prisoners of war were more often killed and not taken as slaves. And like in Egypt, households were not allowed to hold slaves. But the Great Wall of China, which again, big thing, was built by slaves who were public slaves, who were ownership of the government. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about population and registration. So if you look at ancient Greece or Assyria, they were very much like Mesopotamia. There were high advantages from trade. It was difficult to conquer, easy to evade taxes. The very strong stratification with hereditary citizen rights and political participation. On the other hand, Peru in the Andes region was very much like Egypt and China. There was a lot of autarky in production, very little outside trade. There's what was called the vertical archipelagos. Here, conditions of production were more heterogeneous, but the costs of transport were extremely high because of ruggedness. They didn't have the wheel, so they did everything by manual transport. The Aztec and the Maya, on the other hand, in Central America, were city-states where there was a larger role for trade and markets. So what I want to kind of argue is that these differences in the initial relative benefit of trade versus specialized production led either to the development of markets, property right protection, or strong state development embracing all of society. And so I find it quite exciting because you have here two fundamental principles of economics. One is the advantages of trades. That's something we care a lot about. But the other is the advantages of division of labor. Adam Smith's story about the needles, this is also important. And so these ideas have been emphasized in the context of industrialization, but they're fundamental forces also, I would argue, in ancient rural societies. Also, differences in kinship systems were very important. So if you have unilineal kinship systems, that is where you trace your ancestors via only one parent, usually the father, but sometimes also the mother, but let's say the father, this led to very strong clans. Whereas bilineal kinship systems, that's what you had more in Northern Europe, let's say, where essentially you trace your ancestors to your two parents. In those systems, that led more easily to nuclear families and a stronger role for markets. So in market systems, we would tend to see private slaves, strong social stratification, and private property and social stratification tend to foster individualism, because something that really matters in individualist culture is people can get social prestige from standing out, in whatever way. And whereas clan strength, status systems would tend to foster collectivism. And so when you think about these cultural differences, if you compare kind of the content of different religions and philosophies, Confucianism and Buddhism are more collectivists. Greek philosophy, Christian religions, Islam are much more individualistic. So I have a list. I don't have time to talk about it, but essentially one can think of a number of variables that would vary, basically depending on whether you had market systems or statist institutions, and I'll come back to that. So what we've done in the last 2 years, this is a lot of work, and it's not completely finished yet. I don't know when it will really be finished, is to collect data on a lot of variables from the ancient past. So that involves enormous collection of historical information, and we did it for 97 countries. It's not easy. You need to essentially, read a lot of material, make ranking decisions based on, readings of history, archaeology. There's obviously measurement error. But one of the most difficult things is where do you start? When do you start? So for example, you look at ancient Egypt, it was really wiped out, replaced by the Copts, and then later Muslim regime. So what, you want to look at ancient Egypt, or you want to look at, Muslim Egypt, what do you want to do? So, and then many countries have had various critical junctures that influence their history. So our choice here was to focus on the oldest possible period where there were state or quasi-state institutions. So for Egypt, we did choose ancient Egypt, etc. For Latin America, there we have a little bit of a different choice. In some countries, there was a very large Indian civilization, American Indian civilization, and so obviously having an impact. But colonialism in Latin America had a huge impact and lasted for centuries and centuries. So essentially, if you had this pre-existing civilization, we would kind of mix data on institutions both from the past but also from the colonial period. For Africa, colonization lasted less long, and there we chose initial African institutions of the dominant tribes in what are today the important countries, which, by the way, there's a huge variation in terms of what we found in Africa, and these things are very, very important. So just to give an idea here, and for example, for private land ownership, we have a score from 1 to 10, and 1 would be no evidence of private ownership, all land belonging to the state or the ruler, and then 10 would be mostly private land ownership, land can be inherited, rent or sold, et cetera, and then you have scores in between, so we've been scoring variables for different countries. So here, I hope it can be seen, I can't see it very well. This gives a little bit the distribution of private land ownership. You see, it's very bimodal. There were lots of countries where there's very strong private ownership, but many countries where there's very low private ownership, that's mostly state. So here you would have a map that, where you can sort of see the variation. If it's very light, that means there's a low score. The darker, the larger the score. Private property of slaves, I already mentioned that, is a bit similar. Strength of clan, again here, for example, you see in China it's very strong. Egypt is not strong, but in some other countries it's stronger. Social stratification is the strongest in India because there you have the caste system that has been very, very important. And again, there's a lot of variation with many countries. Social stratification was less important. Here we have kinship systems. So in red, you have the unilineal kinship system, which, as I said, makes clan more meaningful. And then in blue, you have the bilineal kinship systems. So there's a lot of variation across the world. Actually, you have also intra-regional variation in many countries, but since we're looking at cultural variables for countries, this is not presented here. So very quickly to finish, what I want to do is just to show two tables, and here showing two regression tables is going to be faster than showing some figures. So you regress essentially the individualism score on different institutional variables. And there are a lot of variables, so I really don't have time to talk about it. But there's a private law index, which would be the variable for private property of land, private property of slaves, and whether the law was essentially horizontal, that is, citizen to citizen, rather than vertical, ruler to the citizen. Political institutions, there we look at whether the country was a city-state or not. We construct an index of power decentralization. I don't have time to talk about that. And we have a variable for the importance of cities, which looks both at levels of urbanization from the past, but also at whether cities were commercial centers rather than administrative centers, that the nature of cities also matters. Then we look at social institutions, that is the role of merchants in society, a weakness of clan, so that's the inverse of clan strength, social stratification, ethnic diversity, bilineal kinship, and then we have an institutional index where you just put everything together. And so what you can see here is that there's just a strong association between institutions from the past and the individualism scores today. So it's quite strong. The less strong is social institutions, and that's due to the fact that social stratification is not robustly associated to these cultural scores. Most countries had social stratification that was really in the middle. You had extremes like India, and in countries that were very egalitarian, but most would be kind of the middle. And here I want to finish by showing reduced 4, which is to regress the individualism score on some geographical measures that can matter, because as I said, I think that the emergence of institutions was related to some geographical conditions. And so we look at the ease of transportation. That's how easy it was to transport goods. That's related to many variables. Heterogeneity in conditions of production, easiness of taxation, and then we collected also variables that are purely objective, not just from the reading of history, but still incomplete. One is distance of the country's capital to the sea. Capital has moved. An indicator of a log of ruggedness, indicator of soil fractionalization, which is kind of a measure of heterogeneity of conditions of production, though clearly it's only partial. And then we looked at the distance to a hot trading zone at that time. So by the way, for all these variables that are over 500 pages of documentation to argue why we chose one score or the other, and this kind of exercise, the only way to make it meaningful is to be transparent and to have people criticize and provide suggestions. So to finish, beyond the 20th century, ancient history is very rich and I would say largely undiscovered terrain for comparative institutional analysis. We found a contrast between statist and market institutions with geographical determinants related to the strength of the benefit from trade relative to economies of scale and task specialization. Finally, these ancient institutions are associated with cultural differences that play a very important role in today's world, and that do have an effect on modern economic behavior. Sorry for having been too long. Thank you.
Hi. I had a question about how do you, so I had several sub-questions just about how do you convert your entire set of research into numerical data?
So essentially, this is, I just showed the example from private land ownership, but it's really, based on, on reading, we kind of come up with more continuous way of scoring these things. So again, the only thing that matters is kind of a comparison. So for every variable, we have a precise way we decided on the scoring, and that can be changed, but that's
so just taking any random variable, two specific sub-questions. One is, how do you compare something that happened in 3000 BC versus 1000 BC, and you're really confident that that scaling is actually correct to even run a regression analysis? And what do you do when you don't have any data? There are periods where even libraries may not have any data for like 500 to 1,000 years for a particular set of countries. And you'd have vast missing data in your...
Several answers. It's a little bit like, for example, the work of Andre Schleifer, et cetera. When you measure particular institutions, you try to come up with certain characteristics. So a lot of the variables I didn't present. So for example, private ownership of slaves is a sum of 4 different variables, and we try to be as objective as possible, and we want to subject the way we do this scaling to people's criticism. On the missing data, when there's just no data, there's no data, and then obviously we can't do very. But there's so the one thing that you can criticize is that we chose particular period in ancient history that's around the formation of states. So that's the period we chose, and there can obviously be missing things, but since institutions have a lot of persistence, it's not the case that they were white, 1 year and then black the other year. So there was a lot of persistence. So throughout most of Mesopotamian history, there were city-states, but you had periods, could have lasted 100, 150 years, where you had a territorial state. So but we do this, we come up with this measurement, and we see how it's associated with measures of modern culture, and it's quite strong, actually.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for your talk. I'm Anderson. I'm a marketing guy, but I focus mostly on economic development in emerging markets. So with that lens, I really enjoyed you mentioning the lineal trek and as an influence for markets being the path to prosperity and prestige. Where in the world do you see this happening going forward?
So essentially, one thing I want to get out of this is that we have to understand that the world in which we live today has really different cultures. And we have to recognize that they are there, and not doing this can really lead to wrong things. And one of my motivations here is really China. China is a market economy, but it has a very ancient civilization. The values are quite different, the institutions are quite different, and we just have to understand those differences. And so right now, this is I'm not taking any policy conclusion from this. It's really just trying to understand the world we live in, so that we can better understand each other. There's several times I've said this morning that especially. Nathan was talking, people go in developing countries and they just don't know anything, and then they come up with policies that are wrong. I think that's kind of the really basic starting point, not more.
So I would describe producing new data, quantifying a large body of work as a good deed. So I'm going to invoke the no good deed goes unpunished principle and suggest more work. Let me give up some background. There's an organization called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation that produces this set of measures called the Global Burden of Disease. And I heard someone from there say, this is what we do. Any place in the world will give you our best estimate of, say, the global burden of disease, and we'll give you our confidence interval. So there's some places they know very little, and so it's big, but they still come up with the best estimate. Others, it's is more precisely estimated. I think it would be great as a next step to think about, bringing some of that distributional information into your measures. Like if you stick with your 10-point kind of scales, instead of like putting all the, like 100% probability on one, you could think about putting it on, a few. And like all of these things, it's a process that will improve over time. But I think part of what's so valuable about this new kind of Bayesian methodology is it gets us out of this trap we were stuck in when there was good data, we published that, and then bad data, it's just ruled out of, out of bounds. There's lots of information in some stuff that you might think of as not quite as good as the best data, and there's a lot of actually things we call good data, which aren't very good, and we ought to, be careful about how much weight we put on those. So, so as I said, it's more work, but it's a sign of the importance of this kind of project.
I think it would be great to have confidence intervals here. It may, create more confidence in the work that we're doing. Disadvantage is that it's very much sort of, pop and mom thing. I've been, hiring students, and I don't have such a big organization. But one thing that was suggested to me is to do this in a panel setup. That is to see how some of these variables, have changed over time, taking, over 100 years, a rolling window of 100 years or something like that. And actually, this is something that we're doing in another context. For example, we're looking at the evolution of institutions of land ownership, a little bit, using the same variable there, but then over time in different countries, but in a completely different set. It's anything is just requiring work, and you have to be transparent, and the criticism of peers is very important.
So I don't know how to kind of decide what's the relative priority of these two tasks, but in a sense, maybe what's important now is just to even leave open the possibility of an elaboration. So, there might be some countries where you've got some bits of data that support, like category 4, and then some others that support category 5. If in at least a few of your data points you report, like probabilities that are less than 1 for a couple of values, it just starts to signal to everybody that, as we move forward, we'll flesh this out. And you said it's a kind of a mom and pop operation. Yeah, it's mom and pop for the first moment, but it's mom and pop for the second moment too. And you may as well do it, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It'll get better. So,
but in one way, because I work with history students mostly, and because they are very good at reading fast. They know where the material is, etc. And they were kind of shocked to say, "What, you're going to put numbers on this?" And essentially, once you start, comparing countries, then it comes in a way more automatically. So again, it's the ranking that matters here. Score has absolutely no meaning. It's the same like the individual score 100 has no meaning, but having U.S. compared to, let's say, Russia, to that's the only thing that has meaning. In any case, I think this is an exercise that has a lot of measurement error, but I really do believe that once you can quantify things one way or another, you just get much more information put together, and I think it can help to understand better history, and I think that's part of the digitalization of history, is just take what we have, what we know. So, for example, there's this research looking at graves of the ancient past to try and measure inequality. I think it's a very good idea. So there will be probably even more ideas. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned that your research was built on volumes of written data. But many of the developing nations come from oral traditions.
Mhm.
And so my question to you is, how do you incorporate oral traditions, folklore, et cetera, in terms of identifying the indicators that are now being evaluated?
Well, only to the extent that, you know, there's been writing about them. In some cases, oral traditions, you know, completely disappeared, and we know nothing, and probably, you know, we will know nothing until maybe somebody finds another indirect way of doing things. So it is imperfect. But by the way, so because this is particularly important for Africa, for example.
Yes.
And you know, and as you can see, there's not that many countries that we have in Africa. But I was surprised, and maybe this is me being naive or ignorant, that the diversity, the extremely large diversity of institutional arrangements in Africa on all aspects. And this is something many people probably know, but to me, I thought that was something, you know, very interesting. So.
Yes, I'm also impressed with how strong oral traditions have consistently lasted over the centuries. And it just seems to me that this is a very important aspect in our research, that we really need to maybe do some collaboration with anthropologists or others who have given quite a bit of support in those traditions. But thank you so
I totally
much.
agree. Yeah.
Thank you also, the work of, I always called him Hafstidi, so thanks for correcting my pronunciation of his name.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is that it? Okay. Thank you very much.